England, 1943. Spring arrived late, bringing with it a damp fog that seemed to seep into every crack in the brickwork and every lining of a leather jacket. For Second Lieutenant Thomas Miller, who had just arrived at the Halesworth base in Suffolk, the air was a pungent mix of high-octane fuel, mud, and an indescribable scent of restlessness. As a fresh pilot for the U.S. Army Air Force's 56th Fighter Group, Miller's palms were slick with sweat. It wasn't because of the Nazi Luftwaffe he would soon face, but because of the row of behemoths parked in front of him, the P-47 Thunderbolt. In that era, the aesthetic standard for fighter planes was defined by the British Spitfire, elegant, slender, and agile, like a silver sword piercing the heavens. The P-47, however, was the complete antithesis of that aesthetic. When Miller first walked around the aircraft to inspect it, he could barely believe the thing could fly. "Looks like a milk jug with wings, doesn't it?" Master Sergeant Eddie, a chain-smoking crew chief standing under the wing, blew a smoke ring. He slapped the thick aluminum skin of the fuselage, producing a dull, heavy thud. "But don't let the looks fool you, Lieutenant. This is a flying tank." The jug. That was the nickname the pilots gave it. The aircraft's empty weight alone was nearly 4.5 tons. Fully loaded for takeoff, it reached a staggering 8 tons. By comparison, the German Bf-109 and FW-190 looked like flimsy toys. Miller stared at the massive four-bladed propeller and the nose that seemed to stretch on forever, filled with doubt. How could such a clumsy, giant dogfight with agile German fighters at 30,000 feet? However, the commander of the 56th Fighter Group, Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, a man with sharp eyes who always seemed to be chewing on a cigar, gave the new pilots a rude awakening in the briefing room. "Forget everything you learned in flight school about dogfighting," Zemke's voice echoed through the smoke-filled room as his pointer slammed against the P-47 diagrams on the chalkboard. "If you try to turn with the Japs or the Germans in this plane, you are tired of living. The P-47 is not a ballerina. It's a strongman with a sledgehammer. We use its strengths, dive, speed, and its goddamn unbelievable toughness." Miller didn't know it then, but he was about to strap himself into not just a plane, but one of the most violent marvels of engineering in aviation history. The soul of this aircraft was a beating mechanical heart, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp. It was an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine capable of unleashing a terrifying 2,000 horsepower. To tame this beast, Alexander Kartveli, the designer at Republic Aviation, had installed a massive and complex turbocharger system in the belly of the plane. This was the reason for the P-47's portly fuselage. It was carrying an entire industrial ducting system inside its gut. On his first orientation flight, Miller felt the raw power. When he pushed the throttle, the roar of the R-2800 was like thunder rolling overhead. The plane tore down the runway, the G-force pressing him back, not with a gentle push, but with irresistible violence. As the 8-ton metal monster lifted off and punched through the clouds, Miller realized that as long as he maintained his energy, nothing could stop it. But he also discovered the plane's other side, its clumsiness at low speeds. Without sufficient altitude and airspeed, the P-47 handled like a flying brick. This filled him with unease about the battles to come. The German pilots were no fools. They flew the nimble FW-190 Shrike, the deadliest killer in the European skies at the time. Trust your armor, trust your engine. That was the only advice the veteran pilots gave him. As long as you don't lose speed, you won't die. In June 1943, the 56th Fighter Group, later known to the world as the Wolf Pack, began frequent escort missions, shielding B-17 Flying Fortress bomber formations deep into the continent. Miller's 61st Fighter Squadron received their orders. This was his first taste of real combat. In the frozen world at 30,000 feet, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Although the P-47 had an advanced cabin heating system for its time, Miller still felt his hands and feet going numb. At this altitude, the thin air strangled the performance of liquid-cooled engines. But the massive turbocharger in the belly of the P-47 swallowed the thin oxygen like a greedy beast, compressing it and feeding it into the R-2800, allowing the monster to churn out staggering power. "Bandits, 6 o'clock, high!" An urgent warning crackled through the headset. Miller whipped his head around. Through the canopy, though the early Razorback design limited rear visibility, he strained to search. He saw the iconic black crosses. A swarm of yellow-nosed FW-190 dived like vultures from above, heading straight for the lumbering B-17s. "Drop tanks, Zemka tactics, dive attack." The flight leader's command was concise and powerful. Miller hit the release lever, and the paper drop tank under the belly tumbled away. Instantly, the P-47 felt as if a 1,000-pound weight had been lifted. He pushed the stick forward, the nose dropped, and with the aid of gravity, the 8-ton fuselage instantly transformed into a massive meteor. This was the terror of the P-47, its dive performance. No Axis fighter could catch it in a dive. The airspeed indicator spun wildly, the needle rapidly approaching the 500 miles per hour red line. Miller grit his teeth, his gun sight reticle locking onto an FW-190 that was pulling up to attack a bomber. He squeezed the trigger. The 8.50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns in the P-47's wings roared in unison. This wasn't just shooting, it was sawing. Nearly 100 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition were spewed out every second. Miller watched as the FW-19's wing disintegrated in the rain of lead, torn apart as if by an invisible giant hand. But he had no time to celebrate. Massive G-forces pinned him to his seat. He had to pull out of the dive before smashing into the ground. Summoning all his strength to haul back on the stick, the P-47's rugged frame withstood the immense G-load, groaning as it clawed its way back to the high heavens. This was the boom and zoom tactic Colonel Zemke preached. Use energy superiority to strike the enemy repeatedly like a pendulum, never getting sucked into a turning dogfight. However, combat was not always one-sided. In the chaos of the dogfight, Miller saw a wingman get jumped by 3 Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s. The P-47 was hammered, debris flying everywhere. A massive hole was punched through its left wing, and half the flap was torn away. "He's done," Miller thought desperately. If it had been a Spitfire or a P-51 Mustang, a hit to the liquid cooling system would have seized the engine in minutes. But the P-47 kept roaring. The air-cooled radial engine, even with a cylinder shot out, continued to run stubbornly. The smoking jug didn't fall. Instead, it used a dive to shake off its pursuers and wobbled its way back toward the English Channel. That night, at the officers' club bar, the surviving pilot held his drink with a trembling hand, yet his face wore the ecstatic grin of a man who had cheated death. "I don't understand it," he told Miller. "I heard the bullets hitting the armor plate behind me. It sounded like someone banging on a stainless steel bathtub with a drumstick. I thought I was dead, but that damn engine just wouldn't quit. It brought me home." This was only the beginning. The legend of the P-47's durability was just the opening act. If Miller's experience built his trust in the P-47, the events of June 26, 1943, completely reshaped the concept of a fighter plane for both the Allied and German air forces. That day, Robert S. Johnson, a rising ace of the 56th Fighter Group, faced perhaps the most harrowing survival challenge in aviation history. Returning from an escort mission, Johnson's P-47 was damaged in combat. His hydraulic system failed, and his canopy was jammed shut, trapping him inside. Worse, he had fallen behind the formation. In these lethal skies, a straggling, wounded plane was the perfect prey. Miller was on the fringe of the returning formation. He didn't see the entire fight, but he heard the chaotic calls over the radio and saw the wreckage of the plane afterward. A German FW-190 had latched onto Johnson. The pilot was no novice. It was the renowned German ace Egon Meyer. Meyer looked at the clumsy American plane and thought it was a gift from God. He casually moved into attack position and pressed the firing button. The FW-190 unleashed a torrent of 20mm cannon shells and 7.92mm machine gun fire at Johnson. Normal logic dictated that a fighter hit by a few 20mm shells would disintegrate or explode. But the next few minutes became a lifelong nightmare for Egon Meyer and the moment the P-47 ascended to godhood. Johnson sat in the cockpit, listening to death knocking at the door. Shells pierced the fuselage, shredded the instrument panel, and smashed the rudder. His plane was instantly turned into a sieve. Since the canopy was jammed, he couldn't bail out. He could only huddle behind the heavy armor plate and let the Germans shoot. The steel armor plate behind the P-47 cockpit, weighing hundreds of pounds, became the barrier between life and death. Bullets and shrapnel pinged and clanged against it, yet failed to penetrate that final layer to touch the pilot's flesh. Meyer fired all his machine gun ammunition. Then he fired all his cannon shells. He was certain the plane should be a fireball by now. But when he flew close to inspect his kill, he was horrified to find the P-47, though riddled with holes, was still flying level. The fuselage looked like a piece of Swiss cheese, and one of the R-2800 cylinders had been blown away, spraying oil all over the cockpit. Yet the engine kept chugging along, thump, thump, thump. Meyer flew alongside, close enough to see Johnson's terrified but very much alive face. The German ace shook his head in confusion. He had never seen such a resilient opponent. Finally, out of ammunition, Meyer rocked his wings in a gesture of respect, or perhaps helplessness, and peeled away. When Johnson crash-landed the scrap metal on the grass at Manston, Miller and the ground crew rushed over, stunned into silence. They tried to count the bullet holes, but lost patience. "This is impossible," Sergeant Eddie said, taking off his oil-stained cap and staring at the fuselage with his mouth agape. If this were a Spitfire, it would be confetti. The statistics were jaw-dropping. The fuselage bore the scars of 21 hits from 20mm high-explosive shells and over 200 machine gun holes. The rudder was almost gone, the hydraulic system was destroyed, and the wing spars were damaged. But Robert Johnson climbed out of the cockpit alive, suffering only minor burns and scratches. Miller looked at the P-47, battered but still standing tall, and felt a surge of security he had never known before. This was why they called it the Jug. It wasn't just a weapons platform, it was a fortress. The R-2800 engine had an absurd level of redundancy. Even with cylinders blown off, even with the oil drained, it could keep running long enough to bring a pilot home. And the semi-monocoque structure and heavy armor allowed it to withstand punishment that should have been fatal. During that bloody summer, the 56th Group began to make history. Although the P-47 lagged behind the Bf-109 in climb rate and turn radius, as long as the fight happened above 25,000 feet, the turbocharger's horsepower advantage crushed everything. And once in a dive, the P-47 was invincible. More importantly, this extreme survivability changed the pilot's mindset. "If I were in any other plane, I might have bailed out long ago," Johnson told the other pilots in the briefing room that night, his eyes steely from the day's encounter. "But in this crate, you know you have a chance. And as long as you have a chance, you dare to turn around and bite back. Data showed that the P-47's loss rate per sortie throughout the war was only 0.7%, a record-breaking figure. Behind this cold statistic were countless pilots like Johnson, brought home from certain death by this flying tank. Miller ran his hand over the metal skin of his plane, feeling the cold, hard texture. He knew the war was still long, and countless tests of life and death lay ahead. But in that moment, he was certain. As long as he was inside this hunk of iron, he held the best possible hand for survival in these brutal skies. For the Luftwaffe, the nightmare was just beginning. They were about to face not just a plane that was hard to shoot down, but a new philosophy of air combat, one where industrial might and damage tolerance crushed the art of finesse. The autumn of 1943 brought good news for Tom Miller, a promotion to first lieutenant, but for the 8th Air Force as a whole, it was a dark time. Although the P-47 had proven itself indestructible in combat, it had a fatal Achilles heel: range. The early P-47s were like bulldogs on a chain. Their fuel capacity only allowed them to escort bombers to the German border. Once they reached Aachen or Emden, just when the bombers needed protection most, the P-47 pilots were forced to turn back as their low-fuel warning lights flickered on. Watching those B-17s fly alone into the German interior, then seeing them sliced up like sausage by Nazi fighters, the feeling is worse than death, Miller wrote in his diary. But change was quietly underway. One morning in November, ground crews at Halesworth began attaching strange objects to the bellies of the P-47s, 75-gallon, and later 108-gallon, drop tanks made of pressed paper pulp and glue. Although these crude tanks looked like cheap paper toys, under the consumption of the R-2800 engine, they meant extended combat radius. "This isn't just a tank, it's our freedom pass," Colonel Zemke said to his pilots, standing before crates of the new equipment. "From today on, the Krauts can no longer breathe a sigh of relief when they check our tails. We're following them home." With the continuous improvement of the P-47D model, especially the strengthening of the wing pylons, the 8-ton Jug began to show its potential as a strategic weapon. It was no longer just a short-legged bodyguard. It was transforming into a long-handled warhammer, capable of striking deep behind enemy lines. By December 1943, with the widespread use of the new drop tanks, the 56th Fighter Group's combat radius extended shockingly deep into Germany. When Miller and his comrades first escorted the bombers past Bremen and continued eastward, the intercepted German radio traffic was filled with panic and confusion. The German pilots were used to the Allied escorts turning back at the border. They took off to intercept at that precise moment, as usual. But this time, they were met by a swarm of P-47s, drop tanks jettisoned, tanks full of internal fuel, ready to fight. In that battle, Miller experienced true energy fighting. He dropped his tanks at 28,000 feet. As the paper containers tumbled away, the R-2800 engine seemed to slip its leash. Miller pushed the throttle, the turbocharger screamed, and the massive 4-bladed propeller sliced through the thin air. Below him, a formation of Bf-110 heavy fighters was preparing to launch rockets at the bombers. They were completely unaware of the killing intent hiding in the clouds above. "Wolf Pack, attack!" Dozens of P-47s nosed over simultaneously. It was a triumph of physics. The kinetic energy accumulated by 8-ton metal blocks diving from nearly 30,000 feet was devastating. Miller's airspeed indicator swept past 450 miles per hour, the plane vibrating and roaring like an express train. When he squeezed the trigger, 8.50 caliber machine guns spat tongues of fire. This wasn't just shooting, It was a metallic waterfall of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The unlucky BF-110 didn't even have time to maneuver. Miller's stream of fire acted like a giant chainsaw, instantly shearing off its right wing. The fireball blossomed in the air, while Miller's P-47 used the immense inertia of the dive to pull up like a bouncing ball, shooting back to the safety of high altitude. This was the creed Colonel Zemke instilled in the 56th. Never tangle with the Germans at low altitude. Use the P-47's unrivaled dive speed and high-altitude performance to strike like lightning, then vanish into the clouds. As 1944 arrived, the 56th Fighter Group established its dominance within the 8th Air Force. Not only were they the unit with the most kills, but they were also the only group that refused to switch to the P-51 Mustang, sticking with the P-47 until the war's end. For aces like Francis Gabby Gabreski, the P-47 was not just a plane, it was the only platform that guaranteed survival and sustained firepower in massive melees. The Mustang is a horse, but the Thunderbolt is a rhino, Gabreski once told Miller in a private conversation. When you get hit in a chaotic dogfight, you'll thank God for those tons of armor. During this period, Zemke invented a revolutionary tactic, Zemke's fan. He no longer tethered the escort fighters tightly to the bomber formation as targets. Instead, he spread the P-47s out in a massive fan shape ahead of the bombers, aggressively hunting down German fighters and breaking up their formations before they could assemble. Miller had grown into a seasoned flight leader. During the famous Big Week air offensive, his plane, the Suffolk Avenger, witnessed the breaking of the Luftwaffe's spine. It was a freezing February afternoon over Hanover when the 56th encountered the elite of the Luftwaffe, Jagdgeschwader 26, JG-26. They were experts flying the long-nose FW-19-0D. The battle erupted instantly. The sky was filled with black flak puffs and white contrails. Miller latched onto a lead plane trying to climb and attack. The FW-190 was agile, the pilot clearly a veteran, executing a sharp split S to lure Miller into a low-altitude turn fight. 6 months ago, Miller might have hesitated, but now he had absolute faith in the machine beneath him. He didn't blindly follow the enemy into the turn. Instead, utilizing the P-47's immense vertical momentum, he executed a high yo-yo. He inverted the plane at the apex of the maneuver, looking down at the enemy through the glass above his head. For a moment, the P-47 seemed suspended in the air. Then, gravity and 2,000 horses combined to shove him downward. When the range closed to 300 yards, the FW-190 filled his gun sight. "Go to hell!" Miller roared, pressing the firing button. The fire density of the P-47 was among the most terrifying of all single-engine fighters in World War II. 8 heavy machine guns could pour out hundreds of rounds in seconds. This firepower didn't need surgical precision. It just needed to cover the target to tear it apart. The German fighter's canopy shattered in the hail of bullets, followed immediately by the ignition of the fuselage fuel tank. The FW-190 turned into a tumbling ball of fire, plummeting toward the German soil. In the same airspace, another legend was unfolding. Another 56th ace, David Schilling, out of ammunition and flying a battered P-47, managed to force 2 German fighters to collide solely through the shockwave of his dive and aggressive feints. This was the style of the wolf pack, ferocious, cunning, and supremely confident. By the spring of 1944, the 56th Fighter Group's kill count began to skyrocket as they raced toward the title of top scoring group. In May 1944, as the Allies made final preparations for the Normandy landings, Halesworth Base welcomed a new guest, the P-47 D-25. When Miller first saw the new plane, he almost didn't recognize it. The razorback ridge that had blocked rear visibility for so long was gone, replaced by a crystal-clear, teardrop-shaped 360-degree bubble canopy. My God, it's like sitting in a convertible. When Miller first sat in the D-25 cockpit, the panoramic view shocked him. He only had to turn his head to see the tail rudder. No longer did he have to worry about a German sneaking into his 6 o'clock blind spot. The psychological impact of this improvement was immense. Before, P-47 pilots had to maneuver frequently to check their rear. Now they had the eye of God. Beyond visibility, the new plane carried more internal fuel and had reinforced pylons. The P-47 D-25 wasn't just an air superiority fighter. It was an aerial arsenal loaded with bombs and rockets. This foreshadowed its new role in the coming campaign for Europe. But on the eve of D-Day, the P-47 D-25's main job was still sweeping the skies. During a deep escort mission to Berlin, Miller encountered the most dangerous moment of his flying career. On the return trip, his formation crossed paths with a group of Me-262 jet fighters diving from high altitude. It was the first time Allied pilots faced jet speed. The things were fast as ghosts. Ordinary propeller planes couldn't catch them. "Ignore their speed. Hit them in the turn." Gabreski's calm voice came over the headset. When one Me-262 tried to use its speed advantage to slash through the bomber formation, it made a mistake. It tried to slow down to aim. For a jet, speed was life. Once it slowed, its terrible acceleration was exposed. Miller was cruising high above in his brand new bubble canopy P-47. Using his all-around vision, he sharply caught that moment. Without hesitation, he shoved the stick forward. The R-2800 roared, and with the engagement of the water injection system, the engine output spiked instantly to over 2,300 horsepower. Even against a jet, the P-47's terminal velocity in a dive was terrifying. Miller felt the plane shudder violently, the compressibility of the air making the stick heavy as lead. But he kept the nose locked on the Me-262. Just as the German pilot prepared to pull up and escape, Miller's 8 guns opened up. A dense web of lead covered the Me-262's flight path. The jet's left engine took a direct hit and spewed black smoke. Stripped of its speed advantage, the Me-262 was a sitting duck. Miller gave his opponent no respite, firing continuously until he watched the aircraft representing the pinnacle of Nazi technology explode and disintegrate in midair. As he pulled the nose up, looking out through the perfect streamline of the bubble canopy at the azure sky, Miller realized that although a new era was dawning, at least today, in this sky, the P-47 Thunderbolt was still the undisputed king. As D-Day approached, the 56th Fighter Group received new orders. While they remained air combat aces, the P-47's thick armor and massive payload capacity showed Allied command its potential for a different, brutal kind of warfare: ground attack. The days of hunting in the clouds were ending. Miller and his Jug were about to dive into the dangerous low altitudes, straight into the face of German Flak and Tiger tanks. June 1944. The summer sky over Normandy was plastered with black and white invasion stripes. To prevent friendly fire from anti-aircraft crews, every Allied plane bore these striking bands on wings and fuselage. For Tom Miller, these stripes signaled that the war had entered a new, bloodier phase. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer just a bodyguard for bombers. As the P-51 Mustang took over the baton for long-range escort, the P-47's massive payload and indestructible frame found a new, perhaps more fitting stage: ground attack. "This is what they call Jabo, Jagdbomber," the squadron commander said in the briefing room, pointing to a map clustered with German armor concentrations. "Boys, we're going to crack open some tin cans." Under the wings of Miller's P-47D hung 2 500-pound bombs and several 5-inch HVAR high-velocity aircraft rockets. Fully loaded, The Jug was heavier than ever, breaking the 8-ton mark on takeoff. But under the roar of the R-2800 engine's 2,300 horsepower, on war emergency power, the steel beast still stubbornly clawed its way off the runway. If high-altitude combat was a duel between knights, low-altitude ground attack was a knife fight in the mud. During the Battle of the Falaise Pocket, Miller experienced this terror firsthand. Flying at treetop level, the sensation of speed was dizzying. Below, on the fields of France, retreating German convoys formed long snakes. Target straight ahead, cleared hot. Miller pushed the nose down, his sights settling on a truck laden with ammunition. He fired the rockets first. With a shrieking whoosh, columns of smoke streaked toward the ground, instantly reducing the truck to its component parts. Immediately, he pulled up, his 8 heavy machine guns beginning to comb the road. The firepower of the P-47 was devastating against ground targets. The 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds easily punched through the top armor of half-tracks and light tanks. For the infantry, it was a rain of steel from the heavens. However, the return fire from the ground was equally ferocious. German 20mm and 37mm flak guns wove a net of fire. "I'm hit!" his wingman, Peters, screamed over the radio. Miller turned to look. Peters' P-47 had just passed through a flak trap. A 37mm shell had blown a hole the size of a wash basin in his right wing. Miller could clearly see the spars inside. Any other plane would have suffered structural failure and crashed immediately. But the P-47 merely shuddered violently, then charged forward like an enraged bull. Peters even had the capacity to swing his nose around and strafe the flak position that had hit him. "What is this thing made of? Concrete?" Peters asked, his voice shaking. "American steel, kid," Miller replied. In those months, P-47s destroyed thousands of tanks, trucks, and locomotives. German soldiers gave the plane a new, terrifying nickname, the Reaper. When that distinctive R-2800 roar echoed at low altitude, experienced German tankers would abandon their vehicles and run, knowing that even a Tiger tank couldn't withstand a top attack from this flying bathtub. As the winter of 1944 approached, most Allied fighter groups transitioned to the lighter, longer-ranged, and prettier P-51 Mustang. However, the 56th Fighter Group, built by the spirit of Colonel Hubert Zemke, who had been transferred, though his influence remained, made a stunning decision. They refused to switch, insisting on flying the P-47 Thunderbolt until the end of the war. This decision caused controversy at the time, but during the Battle of the Bulge, history vindicated the Wolfpack's foresight. December 1944. The Ardennes forest was buried in snow. Atrocious weather grounded the Allied air forces, allowing the Germans to launch their final major counteroffensive. When the skies finally cleared, the 56th Group's P-47M models, the ultimate variant optimized for high-speed air combat, took to the air. Miller was now a battle-hardened major. He flew the P-47M, boasting 2,800 horsepower and a top speed of 470 miles per hour, hunting in the freezing Belgian skies. While other P-47 units were tasked with mud moving, the 56th still saw themselves as pure air superiority hunters. They were out to prove that even at the end of the war, this 8-ton jug could school any German plane daring enough to fly. On December 23rd, Miller encountered the Luftwaffe's final frenzy. Approximately 30 Bf-109s and Fw-190s attempted to attack the American forces besieged in Bastogne. Miller led his squadron, dropping like meteors from 20,000 feet onto the enemy formation. It was a slaughter, and the ultimate demonstration of the P-47's damage tolerance. In the melee, Miller latched onto a Bf-109K. The pilot was an expert, using the clouds to maneuver constantly. Just as Miller found a firing solution, an FW-190 hiding in the blind spot ambushed him. Bang, bang, bang! Violent impacts shook the cockpit. Miller felt as if he'd been kicked hard in the back. The glass on the instrument panel shattered, shards slicing his face mask. His right wing took hits, flaps blown away, hydraulic fluid spraying across his face. Most terrifyingly, the R-2800 engine was hit. The vibration was so intense he could barely hold the stick. In a liquid-cooled P-51, the loss of coolant would seize the engine in minutes, forcing a bailout. But this was a P-47. This was an air-cooled monster. Miller wiped the oil from his goggles and checked the temperature gauge. Cylinder head temps were spiking, but he could still feel the power. The engine, with a cylinder shot out, coughed like an asthmatic old man and spewed black smoke, but it would not stop turning. "Don't die on me, old buddy. Get me home," Miller shouted, slapping the dash. Using the last of his energy, he executed a sloppy barrel roll, forcing the pursuing enemy to overshoot. In that split second, despite his crippled airframe, he squeezed the trigger. The fury of 8 machine guns blew the FW-190 out of the sky. It was Miller's 5th confirmed kill, officially making him an ace. But there was no time to celebrate. Flying a smoking, near uncontrollable wreck, he limped back across the front lines, eventually crash landing on a temporary strip near Liège. Sparks flew as the plane skidded along the snowy runway, finally grinding to a halt. Rescue crews rushed forward. Looking at the plane perforated like Swiss cheese, no one believed the pilot could be alive. But Miller pushed open the jammed canopy, crawled out with a face covered in oil, and lit a crushed cigarette. "If that were a Mustang, you'd be a martyr, Major," a medic said as he bandaged him. "That's why I love this damn jug." Miller blew a smoke ring, looking at the steaming engine with eyes full of reverence. May 8, 1945. VE Day. The war was over. The hustle and bustle of Halesworth Base gradually faded into silence. Statisticians chalked up the final tally for the 56th Fighter Group on the blackboard. The numbers were not just cold statistics, but a miracle in aviation history. Aerial victories, 677.5 enemy aircraft. This figure surpassed any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force in the European theater. Even more shocking was that this record was achieved by the P-47, an aircraft not primarily designed as a pure dogfighter compared to the later P-51s. Behind this glorious record lay an even more astounding number, a loss rate of only 0.7% per sortie. Throughout World War II, no other major fighter aircraft could deliver such terrifying firepower while offering its pilots such a high chance of survival. Major Tom Miller stood on the tarmac, stroking the metal skin of his plane, the Suffolk Avenger, one last time. This plane had gone through 3 engine changes. Its wings were patches upon patches, yet it stood there majestic and imposing, a silent monument. He thought of Robert Johnson, the legend who came back with 21 cannon hits. He thought of Gabreski, the group commander who spent the final months in a POW camp. He thought of the comrades who didn't return, and the countless young men like Peters who owed their lives to the P-47's armor. With its 8-ton body, the P-47 proved a truth. In the cruelty of war, survival is victory, and power is truth. It changed the landscape of air combat, proving that a heavy fighter could not only dogfight, but dominate the sky as an all-rounder. It was the spiritual ancestor of the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the pinnacle of the violent aesthetic of American aviation industry. Miller took off his flight cap and threw it into the sky. "Goodbye, Big Jug. You did good." Sunlight pierced the clouds, shining on the P-47's massive 4-bladed propeller, reflecting a golden light. Though the engine was silent in the long river of history, the thunderous roar of the double Wasp would echo forever.